In this lecture, we're going to go way more in depth in Photoshop. In fact, I'm going to go over pretty much every single important tool, adjustment, and filter that there is. So let's go ahead and get started. We're going to go ahead and start off on the top right and then just come down the toolbar here. And I'm going to explain pretty much all of the important tools. There's an unlimited amount of things you could do in Photoshop. We're just going to go over all of the main ones that makes Photoshop Photoshop. At the top of your toolbar is the Move tool. This is great for moving your image around, so I can zoom out and just show you. It makes it so I could easily reposition whichever layer that I have selected here. So if I move my top layer down, I could select my next layer and then move that over. And the Move tool is great for moving things around. It's pretty much that simple. So the next one, we have our Marquee tool. This is good for selecting specific areas. So let's say within my image, I wanted to select just this apple and turn that into a second copy. I can now right click on it and do layer via copy. And now over here, I have a new layer. So I'm going to make all my others invisible. And now this new layer is just the part that I selected. So the Marquee tool is great for selecting specific areas. I could also right click on it and I can do the elliptical Marquee tool or just do it based on a single pixel. But typically the regular Marquee tool is the main one that you would be using within here. The next tool down is our lasso tool, and there's a few different options for this. So here's my typical lasso tool where it allows you to just draw the selection that you want. So I could do that, or I could come in like draw around this avocado here. And if I let go, it's going to snap over to the beginning. Layer via copy. And now I've got a new layer with just my avocado on it. And then I can right click on my lasso tool and there's a few different options up here. So I've got my magnetic lasso tool or polygonal lasso tool. That pretty much just means this one is great for drawing on straight lines. And this one, it's going to kind of snap to your image. So let's go ahead and look at how that would be. If I'm tracing around this orange here, as I'm coming around, I don't even have to click. It's just automatically snapping to what it thinks is a good selection. And it just kind of helps you draw it. Instead of doing it freehand, you would probably be off a little bit more than if it's helping you snap. And then our next tool is going to be the selection tool. So within here, you can right click and there's a few different options. They recently added this object selection tool. There's also quick selection and magic wand. So I'm going to show you all of these. The quick selection tool would make it so, let's say I'm going for this avocado. I'm just going to drag a box around it and hope that Photoshop recognizes what I'm going for. And it did a pretty good job selecting just the avocado. It could tell there was an object within that. So now I'm going to right click over on my quick selection tool and show you the difference. So I'm going to hit Control or Command D on my keyboard to deselect. And now I'm going to brush in on this avocado and it recognized what it was and filled the area pretty well. Now let's say I also wanted this slice of pear, or actually maybe I don't. So now I want to deselect that. The easiest way to do it is pretty much any of your tools on the toolbar. As soon as I click on it, you're going to notice that up here, this menu changes. This menu lets you fine tune the tools that you're selecting over here on the left. So coming back to my selection tool, you can see the plus button allows me to add to my selection. The minus button takes away from my selection. So I'm going to click on the minus button and come over and I can subtract that part of the selection right there and have just this green part here. And so being able to do multiple things with each tool really opens up your creative options of what you can do within Photoshop. Also realizing that each tool can be customized up here, and there's typically a lot of options that you can do to customize it. So instead of just choosing whether I'm selecting it or deselecting it, I can also choose my brush size, hardness. There's a lot of different options for each tool. Now up next, we have our crop tool, and the crop tool is great for cropping our image. So if I wanted to resize this image to here, I could easily do that. I could also like rotate my crop if my horizon's off. And yeah, it's just essentially a basic crop tool. And then whenever you want to go back or undo your settings, you can hit Control or Command Z as a shortcut. And that's gonna go back to where you were before. I'm also gonna hit Control or Command D to deselect my selection there. And now let me right click. So you've got a few different options under crop. The main tool that you're going to be using here is the actual crop tool itself. but they have a new perspective crop they added. They also have a slice tool. So back in the olden days, you could build websites in Photoshop and you would just slice out a certain section, and this could be like a clickable button, but realistically, you're not going to use this tool nowadays. So here's another new tool they just added in, a frame tool for adding in images within a certain section. I don't think you're going to be using that a whole lot, but who knows. The next tool is your eyedropper. This is great for selecting a specific color. So when you come further down, I'll explain this a little more later, but you have your foreground color and then the background color. So let's say I wanted to have black for my brush. I can just click this button and then all of a sudden black is the main color I'm brushing with. I can switch them again back to my foreground color, and then this pink color would be the color I'm brushing with. But let's say I want to change my brush color to this exact shade of red. I can use my eyedropper, click on the red, and you'll notice that became my new foreground color. Or I could click on the orange, the green, etc. And this is a quick way of selecting an exact foreground color to match another color that's already in your picture. So that's the eyedropper tool. I can right click, and realistically, I've never used any of this other stuff. You've got a ruler tool, a few other things that might be helpful in here, but they're not the main tools of Photoshop. This, however, definitely is. This is your spot healing brush, and it works great for removing specific items from your picture. Let's say I want to remove this avocado. I can easily do so just by brushing over it, and Photoshop is going to fill in based on what it thinks should be there. And right now I have it selected on content aware. So it's looking at the content around it. I could change basically the AI it's using to fill in the space. I could also change my brush size to remove smaller objects. So I'm going to make it a lot smaller and then come back to my image. And let's say I just remove this part off the top of the orange for some reason. So I could do that, and it's really easy to remove specific blemishes or different items that you want to just quickly remove from the photo. This is a great tool for doing it. And it has a few different options now. So I can right click on it. There's this spot healing brush, which is great for like pimples or small spots that you want to remove. Then there's the actual healing brush. So this is going to look at a specific part of your image and fill in based off what's next to it. So you start off by holding down Alt and selecting what part you want to bring in. So let's say I want to basically paint pink over this section where the avocado used to be. So I can hold down Alt and select my pink. And now when I brush down here, it's just going to bring in that part from up above and try filling it in well. A more clear example might be if I hold down Alt and select this apple. And now I brush the apple in over on the right. So that's the second variation of the spot healing brush tool, is the healing brush tool. Next, we have the patch tool, which is kind of similar. So for that, I'm going to select the apple here just by drawing around it. And now I can move it to here. And instead of the apple, we're going to have the lemons, and it's going to fill that in for us. So you can see by using these tools, there's going to be different situations where you might want to select a certain one, and you have a bunch of options within here. Then your red eye tool, that doesn't seem to be a problem these days. And then content aware tool. So let's go ahead and select this part in the middle and then move it over to here. And I'm going to hit enter on my keyboard and then Control D to deselect it. So you can see it filled in this section where I removed the lemons based off what it thinks it should have there, looking at the rest of the picture. The picture is definitely a mess now. So I'm going to hit Control Z or Command Z a few times to go back to my original picture. And now let's keep going down the list of tools. So that's it for the spot healing brush section. I'm now going to come down to my normal brush section. The brush allows you to paint a color. So let's say I wanted to paint pink over this apple, and then the color it's going to paint is whichever color is selected here as your foreground color. So I could paint this pink over the orange or wherever I want to paint it. And again, if I want to change the color, I could select my eyedropper and choose, let's say, this orange. I'm going to select my brush again, and now I'm painting orange. I could also just double click on my foreground color, and I'm going to get this pop-up, which allows me to choose it. So I could select, let's say, a blue that isn't in my image yet and start brushing that on. And just like the rest of the tools in the toolbar, as soon as I click on the brush, it's going to give me the option to make some adjustments to the brush. So I can choose the size of the brush, the hardness of it. I can choose the opacity type. I can choose the opacity of it. So let's say I just set it to 10%. And now when I brush, you can kind of see through it. So there are a lot of adjustments you can make for each tool, but I think we're going to just keep quickly going down the toolbar and talking about what each one is. So within the brush, you could also do like a pencil tool, a color replacement brush. There's some specialty items in here, but the brush tool will be your main tool. We're going to go down to the next tool, which is one of the main ones in Photoshop. It's the clone stamp tool. And honestly, it's really similar to your healing brush tool. So I'm going to grab it. We'll come over to the image, and similar to the healing brush, I'm going to hold down Alt and choose the part that I want to be brushing from. And now when I paint up here, you can see my little arrow down below. It's just painting in whatever I have selected down below. And I can change where it's selecting from just based off holding down Alt and then choosing a new place that my part I'm drawing from is going to be wherever I clicked on Alt. And then the part where it's applying is wherever I'm brushing onto. And so that is called your clone stamp tool. And it's, again, really similar to the healing brush, but it is slightly different and can be used in different scenarios. And the next tool, it's another new one. It's called the history brush tool. So when you make changes to your image, you can take this brush and basically brush the parts to go back to how they were. I don't think it's one of the main tools Photoshop's known for, but maybe that's just because it's new. Here's your classic eraser, and the eraser is just going to erase any part of the layer you have selected. So when I erase that, you're going to notice it's now revealing the layer that's down below. But I could select that layer and erase it, and you're going to notice the background down below, which is invisible right now. And so the erase tool, it's just a classic eraser. The next tool down is our paint bucket tool, and that's going to fill an area with whatever your primary or foreground color is that you have selected down here. So I can just click here and it's going to fill in that space with the color I have selected. Now an alternative to the paint bucket is a gradient. And so the gradient, the way this works is you actually draw a line from your starting place to the finishing place, and that's going to do a gradient from your start to your finish. So here's the example. And the color it's using is going to be up here. So it's going from this color to this color. And I can change that to be pretty much whatever I want. So here's a box that pops up when you click on it. And not only can I change the colors, I can add in multiple different colors. Like let's say I wanted to have a gradient of like a full rainbow of colors that it goes through. So let me do that real quick. And not only can I do that, but I can change the opacity of the gradient. So let's say the opacity starts at 0 and then goes up to 100 while passing through the multiple colors that I chose. I'm going to hit OK. And now here's the line of where it starts. Here's the line of where it ends. And you'll notice nothing. And that's because it's going from an opacity to 0 to opacity that's full, but it's matching the background color. So let me go ahead and turn those layers off, and you're going to notice it a lot better now. So it's going from an opacity of 0 and creating a gradient up to basically what I have laid out here. So I think that's a basic enough description of it, but that's your gradient tool. The next tool that we have, so this is our blur, and it's similar to a brush, but the difference is wherever I draw with this blur brush, it's going to blur out that part of the image. So coming back to our fruit photo, I could blur out this orange, and I'm not actually happy with those settings, so I'm going to bring my brush size way up, and I'm going to change the strength from 50% to 100%. And now when I come and brush over the same orange, so now when I click on it, you can see this orange really blurred out. And then the next tool, instead of the blur, I can right click on it and come to sharpen. And opposite of the blur tool, wherever I draw with this one, it's going to really sharpen that part of the photo. And I'm just kind of going over all the tools right now. I'm not necessarily saying the best uses for them yet. That'll be in other videos. I just want you to have an understanding of where things are laid out and kind of what your options are within Photoshop. But one of the main areas that you would do this is in portraits. You might want to like sharpen their eyes, but like blur this part of their face just to make it look a little more flattering. The next tool is well, let me right click on this again. We also have a smudge tool. So this is for like, imagine that you're actually using pencils to draw on a paper and you want to use your finger to kind of smudge or blur the line. This tool is great for that. So let's see if I can do it on here. Okay, it's not looking as great, but if it was a painting, that smudge tool would be working quite a bit better. The next tool on our list is the dodge and burn tool. I really love these tools. So up here, it's important to use your settings on this for the dodge and burn. So I can, basically the dodge is going to make parts of your image brighter, and the burn is going to make whatever you brush darker. But do I want to make just the highlights brighter? Do I want to make the shadows brighter, the midtones? And how much do I want to make them brighter? And how large do I want that brush to be? So we're just going to leave it on the default settings. And this orange you can see is now a lot brighter, and so is the pink part around it where I brush. Alternatively, I can right click, do the burn tool, and wherever I brush with that is going to get darker. And again, I could change my settings if I wanted the strength of it to be stronger, the brush size larger, things like that. So I'm going to right click. I also have a sponge tool. This is for saturation. So I can choose whether it's desaturating the image or saturating the image. I'm going to go ahead and do desaturate first. And wherever I brush, it's going to make it more like a black and white image there. So it's kind of just looking darker on here, but it's taking the color out of the orange. The next tool is our pen tool. Personally, I don't use the pen tool often. I think that this is a great tool to have within Illustrator, but it's not one of the main things that Photoshop is known for. However, you can select it and use your pen tool to draw different shapes. You can also right click and they have a bunch of different variations of it. Here's the text tool. This is great for, you can draw a box and type. So this is text. My size of the text is way too large. I'm going to zoom out because there's a few different things going on. The text created a new layer. I'm going to double click on that. And up here on my size settings, I'm going to bring it down to like 36 point. And as soon as I did that, I could see what I wrote. This is test, meant to say text. And for the color of my text, I can choose that coming up here and change the color. I could have it centered to the left or right. I can change the font and all of those settings. But again, I don't think Photoshop is necessarily known for text. That feels more like something that would be heavily used in Illustrator, but not as much in Photoshop. But you do have the text tool if you want it, if you're creating business cards or a banner, flyer, that type of stuff. The next tool we have is our path selection tool. Again, this and then the move tool, these aren't used a whole lot, but the shape tool can be great if you're wanting to add, let's say, a triangle onto here. And I'm going to zoom out so I can choose the fill color. So if I change this, I can choose the exact color I want, hit OK, and that's going to change my triangle to that color. And also when I create a shape, it creates a new layer for me of the shape that I just created. And if I right click over on my shape, I can choose whether I want a rectangle, ellipse, polygon, line tool, custom shapes. And then your move tool, this just kind of helps you move things around or pan the filter back and forth. And then the zoom tool if you want to zoom into it. But I don't use this often. Typically, I'll change the zoom down here if I want to change the zoom. So let's make it 900%. It's really going to zoom in, and I could change it to 10% and it's really going to zoom out. You can see that's the entire image. So I'll just go back to 200% and call that good for now. And then you can change what tools are in this layout. So right now I have it on Window Workspaces Essential. So if you were going through this list and it doesn't match everything I was saying, you have to make sure Window Workspace Essential is checked. Like if you're on painting, photography, stuff like that, it's going to change the order and layout of the toolbar over here, prioritized on whatever task that you're doing. But I prefer to just leave mine on Essential. That way all the tools are in the same place and everything just kind of works the same way no matter what project I'm working on. And then lastly for over here is your foreground and background colors. This is basically just a quick way to select the color of the brush or whatever it is that you're using at the moment. And let's say I'm going back and forth between green and black. I can just click this to easily switch back and forth on them. Okay, so that's good for the toolbar. Now we're going to go up to this main menu here. So under File, I'm only going to go over the parts of this that I feel are the most important things to know. There's so many menu items that you can probably skip over and it's not a big deal. So I'm just going to go over all the main ones to save time. So new would be creating a new project. You can open up projects. I don't know why they have so many closes in here. Saving is important. A lot of times when you're actually exporting your image, you're just going to do it by clicking Save As and choose the image path of where you're saving it, as well as the file type and the name. So here you'll type in the name, this is where you're saving it, and then this is your file type. The file type is kind of important. So Photoshop, a PSD file, is going to save all of your layers, all of your settings, so that you can easily edit it later. A JPEG is pretty standard. That's going to be probably the most common file type as far as images online. There's also PNG, which you can't see on my screen. Okay, PNG. And this allows you to save it with an invisible background. It also is sometimes a good way of saving smaller images if you're doing it for like online web use. And then obviously you have a lot of other file types in here. You could do a GIF if it's animated, TIFF. You've got a lot of options, but you probably won't use most of them just because you don't need to. So I'm going to cancel that. File. So export, this would only be, you would only use that if you're like exporting for web devices. Like let's say you created a layout for an app or website or something like that. You could slice it up and save it as a website. The next main thing under this file tab would be under your automate. There's a few options in here. So you can do like batch settings. So this works if you have thousands of images that you're wanting to make edits to. So you can create what's called an action, which is a specific series of adjustments. And then you choose the destination folder that it's going to save all of them into after making the adjustments. Probably not something you're going to use often, but it's there if you need it. Under automate, there's also, I don't know if this is default or if this was a third-party thing I did, but fit image allows me to interpolate the image so that it's a lot larger. I can also do merge to HDR or photo merge. So this is good if I'm creating a panorama image and I want to stitch all of the images together. And this is good if I'm creating an HDR photo to have more dynamic range. It's going to put the images together for me and automatically do an HDR. Under scripts, I've got image processing. This is again great for batch images. So if I've got thousands of images I want to do something to, I can select the current image folder that all of those images are into. I can choose where I want them to be saved, choose the file type, the size, things like that. So let's say I have a lot of 100 megapixel photos and I'm wanting to share them to someone online, but the file sizes are way too large. This would allow me to select the folder that all of my large images are into, create a folder that I'd rename as like resized images or small images, and I could automatically resize all of the images, have them save as a JPEG instead of RAW, hit run, and it's going to do that to thousands of photos for me, or however many are in the folder. And then the last thing under file that you might use that might be important would be print, and that's just going to bring up a pretty standard print dialog that allows you to print whatever your project is. Under edit, I'm going to go over some of the main things that you would be using within here. A lot of these just like undo, redo. You could do that. You'll probably memorize the shortcuts for these because it just seems easier. You could do like your transform tool might be a common one. So Control T is free transform, so you can move it around. And then you can also like do horizontal flip, stuff like that. So let me select a layer so that I can show you an example. I'm going to make these layers invisible and then select this one with the fruit that we've been using. Come up to Edit, Transform, and you can see I could do like flip horizontal, flip vertical. I'm just going to click flip horizontal real quick. And you can see it just flipped this image here to be facing the other direction. So that's one of the things I might use under Edit. And then the free transform or Control T, I'm going to show you what that looks like. That puts this box around it so that I can change the size or the perspective of it. So if I hold down Control, it allows me to like warp it in weird ways, or if I hold down Shift. If you do a combination of Control, Shift, and Alt, it's going to change what a lot of your tools do. But for now, I'll just hit Control or Command Z and go back to how it was. So let's come back to Edit. That's about everything that you need to know within this Edit tab. Under Image, there's a lot of stuff in here. So if I'm importing a photo or adjusting my canvas, under Mode, I could choose if that photo is just going to be grayscale, meaning black and white, or what type of color I want to be using, how many bits on the channel. Under Adjustment, this is all of the main adjustments that I could be doing to a photo. So brightness and contrast is each of these windows are going to appear on my other screen, so I'm going to have to drag them over. So the brightness and contrast is going to make my photo brighter or darker, and it's going to bring the contrast up or down. Next, we have levels, curves, exposure. Okay, so curves is a key thing that you should definitely know. So on curves, basically this point here is adjusting your shadows. This point here is adjusting your highlights, and you can select different points within the middle. So I could do what's called a typical S-curve by moving the highlights brighter and the shadows darker, and that's going to add more contrast to my image. Within the curves, I could also choose specific color channels. Like let's say I wanted to bring down just the reds, or I wanted to bring down just the greens. I could also bring down the greens and only the highlights, or bring up the greens and only the shadows. There's a lot of adjustments that you can make within curves. The levels isn't a main one, so exposure, it's similar to brightness, but it allows you to adjust exposure on a few different levels. Vibrance, you have your vibrance and saturation. So saturation is going to add more color to the parts of your photo that have color, and desaturation is basically turning it into like a black and white. That's the opposite of having saturation. And vibrance is really similar to saturation, but it's not supposed to affect skin tones, so you could turn up your saturation without making the people in the photo look super orange. Your color balance allows you to do a lot of color adjustment to your photo. So I can adjust the cyan or red, magenta green, yellow, blue, and then I can choose whether it affects just the shadows, highlights, or midtones. So let's say in only my shadows, I want it to be more blue, and then only in the highlights, I want it to be more yellow. I could make that adjustment, and that's how it comes out. I could make my image black and white, but more than that, it gives me a lot of adjustments on specifically adjusting each color within my black and white photo. So if I wanted to make the reds specifically darker or brighter, etc. And then the next main tools I would use in here would probably be skipping down to like shadows and highlights. So I could bring my shadows up, bring the highlights down if I wanted to add some more dynamic range to my shot. And then replace color tool is going to bring up this dialog, and that might be like the last adjustment I would typically use under that menu. So this allows me to select a specific color, and by adjusting what it calls fuzziness, I can choose the sensitivity to that color. And then right here, I can change what I want that color to become. And so now all of the pinks are becoming blue, but if I zoom out a little more, you can see it didn't select all of the pinks, and so I could bring the fuzziness up, and it's going to increase the sensitivity to that color selected, and it's going to make it whatever color I choose down here. So I could make it a darker blue, brighter blue, I could do it more or less saturation, etc. So that's the final thing under image adjustments. There's a lot of stuff here, and each one of these you could go so in depth with, but that basic overview is going to kind of give you an idea of where they're all located and which ones are probably the most important to pay attention to. So these next three options here, if you're still learning about what you want to do with your images, auto tone, auto contrast, auto color is a quick way for Photoshop to change your image to what it thinks it should look like. And so it will automatically adjust the contrast and color of your image. Image size makes it so that I can make my actual image larger or smaller, and then canvas makes it so I can make the canvas that the image is laying on top of larger or smaller. And the rest of the tools in here you won't use very often. Under layer, there's a lot of options here, but I don't use any of them there because all of those options I would just do within this layers section over here. So if I wanted to duplicate a layer, I'd probably right click here and come up to duplicate. Or if I wanted to merge them, I would right click and come to merge. And so most of the adjustments to the layers I would do over here where it says layers. So under this, I very rarely ever open up that tab. Under type, again, I would very rarely do that. And that's because when I'm using my type tool, as soon as I select it, I've got this bar that gives me most of the options for my type. And if I'm doing more than what I have the option to do from there, I would rather be doing it over in Illustrator than in Photoshop. So under select, the main thing I do is select inverse. And so let me show you a scenario where I would be using that. I'm going to grab my selection tool right here. And let's say I wanted to select basically all of this fruit, but instead of selecting the fruit, I'm going to just select the background. See how it selected everything but the fruit? I can now come up to select inverse, and it's going to select the opposite of whatever I had selected before. So now it's all the fruit that's selected. So that's the main time that I would be using the select inverse option. And then color range. This is another great tool. So with color range, let me zoom out. For select color range, I'm going to get this box. And this is really similar to the replace color box where I choose the color I want and I adjust the fuzziness of it. The difference is instead of turning it into another color, it's just selecting it based off of the color. So again, going to the example, if I want to select just the fruit, if I select this pink color instead, adjust the fuzziness, hit OK, now all of the pink is selected, and I could come up and do select inverse, and now I have just the fruit selected. And that's about all I would use from this select section. They've added a few new things into here, like you could select just the sky or specific subject, things like that, but those aren't tools that I use very often. Under filter, there are a lot of tools within this section. So the main ones would be under blur. Gaussian blur is the main kind of default blur that I use, and it gives you a live preview of how much it's going to blur if you have this preview box selected. So I can make it so it only blurs at a slight amount, or so that it blurs it so much that you can't even see it. And then you just hit OK when you're done, or cancel. So that's filter blur. I could do the same thing with sharpen, which is the opposite of blurring it. And I could do like smart sharpen. It's going to give me this pop-up. And I can choose all of the adjustments I want for sharpening this image. You can see this section here looks a little over sharpened. And so I could fine tune all my settings here. So under filter noise, you could actually add noise if you wanted it to look like a grain from a film camera. You could also reduce noise if your ISO is too high and you want to remove the noise from your image. The render is creating, in my opinion, a lot of cheesy stuff like fake flares and clouds and stuff like that. So I don't use that very often. And that's about the main tools that I use under filter. But there's a lot of them here that you should explore with and that you might enjoy for your projects. Under 3D, I don't use much in here and kind of don't recommend using a whole lot in here. In my opinion, Photoshop is for photoshopping things, and if I was deep diving into creating in 3D, Photoshop probably wouldn't be the tool I'm using for it. Under view, I rarely come into here. It looks like there's zoom in, zoom out, stuff like that. But again, I would just be doing my zooming in and zooming out from this section down here. Plugins, I'm not using a whole lot of third-party plugins. Windows, this allows me to choose my workspace. I pretty much always use it on default. And then if I'm ever talking about something that you don't see on your version of Photoshop, it's probably because that window isn't selected. And so for an example, like properties, layers, stuff like that, if layers wasn't selected, then you wouldn't be seeing this box down here that's called layers. And then help, I never really go under there. And so that is all of the main menu items, all of the main toolbar items, and then all of the adjustments for each of the toolbar items. I know that we have covered a ton of information so far, and we are almost done. There's just a little bit left. So the next section is the layers section. You already have a basic understanding of this, of how the layers are stacked, but here's how to create new layers. You can just click on this little plus item, and it's going to create a new layer. The reason that you would do that is, let's say I'm grabbing my brush tool, and I don't actually want to brush onto this image. I could just brush onto a new layer that I'm creating, and that makes it easier. I can also do something called creating a mask. A mask is basically a more complex version of an eraser. So let me show you an example. The way a mask works is whatever is black will be erased, and whatever is white will come back. So I'm going to grab my brush, and I'm going to choose the color black. And wherever I draw, it's erasing it. Now, the reason you're just barely seeing it is because my brush opacity is set to 10%. So I'm going to change that to 100%. And so now when I draw black, you're really going to see it erase the background. But let's say I just accidentally erased too much and I want to keep this section right here. What I can do is flip over to white, but I want to make sure it's white, white. And wherever I draw with white, it's going to undo the eraser. And it's not really the eraser tool, it's the mask tool. But it's, if you think of it as an eraser, then it would be a little less complex. So wherever I draw with black is going to make this image disappear. And wherever this has white is going to make this image appear. And so, yeah, that's how you can use a mask. That's a basic explanation of it. And the way that you create it is by clicking on this. There's also multiple types of masks that I could be adding on. So instead of doing the default mask where you can see everything unless you draw black on it, and instead I'm going to hold down Alt on my keyboard when I click on the mask, and that's going to create an all black mask, meaning this entire image is invisible unless I draw white onto it. And so that gives you a basic understanding of masks and how to add them. Also, right here is my opacity type. So let's bring this image back, and I'm going to just go down the list of all the different opacity types real quick. So I'm going to start out with normal, and I'll come to this view and I'm just going to hit down arrow. So it's going to go through each of them, and you can just kind of see how it's changing the type of opacity, which changes the influence it has on the image below it. So there's some specific situations and where I might change the opacity type, but typically it's just going to be on normal. And then next to it, I can bring my opacity down, and it's got a sliding scale right here, which is kind of cool because I can slowly slide it and watch the image to see what effect that's going to have on it. This was a very long video, but you now have a basic understanding of where all the main tools are located, what they're called, and the basics of what each one does. So now you get to go more in depth with each tool and understand not just in depth what they do, but how you can actually apply that to your projects.